Before everything starts, I just wanted to make a short clarification. When we send out our notification of the meetings, we always make a deliberate mistake. Sometimes the date and the day don't coincide, and this time we forgot to mention the time. This is called Spot the Deliberate Mistake, but we're not giving any prizes for that. We're just doing it to check that people are actually reading the messages that we've got. Apologies, and we'll see what comes out next time. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone to the second meeting of this session, and we're very pleased tonight to welcome Jonathan Wolfson. Yes, very glad you were able to come, and it's obviously a topic that has excited a lot of people's attention. Possibly because I'm looking around at the age of some of the participants. I mean, not by any means all of them, but some of us can remember what was going on at the time, the column inches in the Jewish Chronicle. But I was a student in Glasgow at the time, and one of our local ministers thought he would go with Louis Jacobs, and that's another story. But it was really quite an exciting period. So it's obviously a good choice for the topic. It's also very nice that our speaker's father has addressed a meeting in the not too distant past about an aspect of the Jews in Wales, and so it's I think it's probably one of the very few father followed by son presentations we've had, so it's very nice to see Bernard and Rosalind here this evening. Our speaker tonight is a historian. He has a PhD in history, but he makes his living, I would say, from IT, and I did see online Graham Weinberg explaining, reading out what this IT involves, and I don't think he could understand it. I certainly couldn't understand it, and when I spoke to Jonny earlier, he said most people wouldn't be able to understand it, and that's why he's able to sell it. So, without any further ado, Jonny, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Tonight's talk is called The Jacobs Affair. It's actually one in a series of 5 British Boyguses that I've spoken about in the past. It's the most recent that we have with such a youthful audience. This will be history, contemporary history. But there's prizes for anyone who can guess what the other 4 are. So it's well known that Jews don't really do theology, and particularly Anglo-Jews don't do theology, which makes the Jacobs Affair kind of all the more striking and unusual, because it is about theology. It is also about other factors as well, whether there was ever such a thing as a Minhag Anglia, and if so, was that a good thing? Should it have been continued? Who led the community, the lay leadership, and if so, who was the lay leadership, or the Beit Din, or the chief rabbis, or the press, or others. So to understand the Jacobs Affair, and it's really, I'd really describe it as a tragedy in 2 parts, as we'll see. There were very few, there were no winners, there were a couple of, no losers, there were no sinners, and most people acted in good faith. But to understand the affair, I think there's a few kind of little pieces of history that need to be put in place first. The United Synagogue, the chief rabbinate, the previous chief rabbis, and Louis Jacobs himself, because he actually had a really interesting biography. He wrote an autobiography, which I would definitely recommend, but for a more up-to-date account of his life, there's actually been a recently published book by Freeman, which is available, still in print, and I would highly recommend it. It's not quite as hagiographic as an art scroll biography, but it's not uncritical either. So the first thing to understand the Jacob's affair is kind of how Anglo Jewry itself was constituted. The United Synagogue was set up in 1870. It was a very powerful centralised body, very much set up on a sort of Anglican ecclesiastical basis, not only the sort of, what they wore, the canonicals, and in fact one chief rabbi wore garters, but also how it was set up itself. So for instance, when the chief rabbinate was set up, the chief rabbi was actually strictly speaking, was the only rabbi. Everybody else was a reverend, and all rabbis were personally beholden to him. He had huge power over the other rabbis. It kind of came with advantages and disadvantages, because it did mean that the reverends, as they were called, were not as themselves as committed or as dependent on their communities as was the case in other places, but it also meant that the chief rabbi's word was law, certainly in theory. So that's kind of your typical Anglo-Jewish. There's not, the pictures are just there because they're more interesting to look at than me. So there's a couple of important things. The first is a very important bylaw, which states that the chief rabbi needs to sanction every appointment to a US rabbinical post. Like most things, that was never really an issue, but as we'll say, obviously, that does become important. And there was also two very important relationships for every chief rabbi, and these changed over time. The first was with the lay leadership, and the second was with the Beit. The lay leadership in Anglo Jewry was obviously always traditionally the more important. The Beit was always a very secondary, very unimportant institution, originally purely there to advise on very strictly defined halachic matters, while the lay leadership had all the powers. And originally, it was led by what's known as the cousinhood, in Chaim Berman's well-known phrase. They were a group of interrelated, aristocratic, in Anglo-Jewish terms, families who pretty much led the community. And one of the important factors behind the Jacob's affair was around this time, the lay leadership was starting to change. And as a result of the immigration originally from Eastern Europe in 1870 onwards, and then more particularly from Central Europe in the 1930s, the lay leadership, the Montagues and the Swalings and the Rothschilds, started to lose their power, and then the new up-and-coming men, such as, we'll see Sir Isaac Wolfson, no relation, say up front, unfortunately, took to the stage, and they had very different views and very different ways of behaving. A second important factor behind it was behind sort of the Jacob's affair were the two previous chief rabbis. The first was the previous one with the current one was Beit, and the previous one was Chief Rabbi Hertz. He believed in a progressive Judaism, as he called it. But if you read his Chumash, and it's still well worth reading even to this day, the documentary hypothesis, which we'll talk about in a minute, is very central, and it's really something he attacks on pretty much every section of essays at the back of each of the 5 Sfarim. So he was very progressive, but he absolutely had no book whatsoever with biblical criticism at all. And in fact, he realised that this was the key danger to the type of Judaism that he wanted, that the documentary hypothesis, biblical criticism, really posed a huge threat and needed to be dealt with. It couldn't be ignored. It actually had to be fought head-on, which is what he tried to do. At the same time, he uses lots of non-Jewish commentaries. I mean, if you compare his Chumash to the Artscroll, it really is like chalk and cheese, Lavdil. And he also tried to keep the US very centrist. He was opposed to the ultra-Orthodox. He tried to prevent the establishment of Gateshead, which we'll come to again. His personality was quite argumentative. It was said of him he always sought the peaceful path to resolve any conflict once he'd exhausted all other avenues. And he had a particularly stormy relationship with Robert Whaley Cohen, who was then the head of the United Synagogue, and particularly in the final months. And as a result of that, Whaley Cohen really did two things, which I think he regretted both of which in later years. The first is he tried to beef up the power of the Beit in order to provide like an almost an opposite power base to that of the chief rabbi. So he brought in some big hitters, Diana Bramsky, who was one, and other men. So the Beit really became, for the first time in Anglo-Jewish history, a body with an impressive leadership, impressive colleagues. And the other thing he tried to do was ensure that his successor, Herz's successor, would be a more emollient figure, a more malleable figure perhaps. Just as an aside, so Diana Bramsky and Hertz really didn't like each other, and just a personal reminisce, I gave a talk once about their battles, which were pretty severe, because Hertz he didn't have the depth of Talmudic knowledge, but he had enough knowledge and enough gravitas to be able to fight Bramsky head on. And Bramsky was a great man. And then a couple of days after I gave this talk, my wife was a senior executive at the BBC, and there was a dinner for all the BBC executives and their spouses, and I was sat next to the head of BBC One, who was Danny Cohen, and his wife, Noreen Hertz, who was Hertz's granddaughter. On the other side of me was the head of BBC Radio, Jenny Abramsky, who was Diana Bramsky's granddaughter. I said, "Oh, your grandparents are hammering tongues at me." Neither had any idea what I was talking about. So let's move to Louis Jacobs himself. And his biography, as I say, is really fascinating. He was born in Manchester, 1920, to working-class Lithuanian parents. And his parents were like, I guess, traditional Manchester Jewry. I hope that doesn't offend anyone. In fact, whenever I give this speech, I always offend someone. There's always some relative or something. So please moichel me in advance if I offend any of your family. His family were traditional Manchester. They went to shul, but they, sort of kept, they took, typical Anglo-Jews. But Louis Jacobs was different. To a very early age, he went to Balkin's Cheder. Now, I say actually there's no saints in this talk, but in fact, if there is one person, whenever I give this talk, someone always comes up to me and says, I went to his Cheder, and I've never, ever heard a bad word about this person. That was Balkin, who ran his Cheder in Manchester, must have been for about 60 years, given the ages of the people who've told me. He was an unbelievable influence on a number of people's lives. He ran it, I think, in like a couple of rooms in Manchester. He was a natural teacher, and he had the most immense influence on a number of very young people, and he changed their lives from a religious point of view in a very positive way, and Louis Jacobs was certainly one of them. As a result of that, he went to Manchester Yeshiva, which was a proper Orthodox yeshiva, and very quickly he outgrew that. He went to Gateshead, which had quite recently been set up. He was in the first set of students at Gateshead, and his name was on the roster, though it's since been taken away, and if you go now, it's like he never existed. But in fact, he was taught by Dessler, the great Dessler, who actually described him as an Eloi, and he was really seen as someone who was going to be an absolute star, not just in Anglo-Jewry Orthodox world, but actually international Orthodox Jewry. He was seen as a brilliant Talmudic student. After Gateshead, he went to Golders Green Beit Midrash. That was already slightly more Hirschian, so I don't want to get slightly more, still religious, but it's more slightly centrist religious than Gateshead itself. And it was untypical of people from that Gateshead world. But the key moment of his life really was at the same time he then did a PhD at UCL on the business life of Jews in Babylon, and as part of that, for the very first time, he was introduced to secular scholarship, which was already now a world away from Gateshead Yeshiva. And he was then appointed the rabbi of Manchester Central Synagogue, where he served for a number of years. And then in 1954, he was appointed rabbi of the New West End Synagogue in London. For those who don't know the New West End, it was the archetypal Anglo shul. It was like the Singers' Hill or the Princess Road. It had a mixed choir still. It was also the shul of the great and the good. And it was also slightly sui generis already then in the United Synagogue world. You would say, if you can use the words right and left, it was certainly on the left. The first minister was Singer from Singer's Prayer Book, who himself actually was a Bible critic. And when he took the post, his induction was by Chief Rabbi Brody, who talked about what an amazing man he was and how he was kind of, fated for great things. But there was already now criticism of him from his erstwhile colleagues in the Gateshead world, who saw him as a renegade and who also worried about him because they realised that he was someone who they believed, from their perspective, had the ability to do damage. And he was already marked out as someone you had to watch and someone you had to be careful of and someone who had to prevent being in a position where his genius and his learning, and there's no doubt that Jacobs was a scholar of the highest level, he could be a leading light in sections of Anglo Jewry which the ultra-Orthodox world looked down on. So that's opening Gateshead Yeshiva, and then, okay, I'll run over this very quickly because I don't want to cause any trouble, and I've been shouted this in the past. So this is obviously something that Orthodox Jews don't believe in. But anyway, what is the documentary hypothesis? It's worth knowing very, very quickly what Bible criticism is, and in a nutshell, it's the idea that instead of there being a single divine author of the Torah itself was written. Again, there's hundreds of different theories and different types, but in a nutshell, most Bible critics agree that the Torah was written by men, by a number of different men, at a number of different times, and it was redacted and put together at some point, i.e. it was not handed down in a piece on Mount Sinai. I won't go into the whole history, but basically people believed there was these different authors: the priestly author P, the Yahwist, the J, the D, the Deuteronomist, the Hadashist, etc., and you can even get Chumashim today where they're color-coded, kind of each paragraph or even each pasuk based on who they think the writer is. Now, the interesting thing about the documentary hypothesis is, even though obviously it's beyond at a basic level, it's beyond the pale of a very literal understanding of Torah min Hashamayim. What do we mean by that? So if you think about Maimonides, he wrote his Principles of Faith, and one of them is that the Torah was given in a piece by God to Moses. But even over the years, there's been lots of different bits. There's some rabbis who've contradicted little bits of it. Ibn Ezra talks about Vayidufu. Again, I'm just going to say it in Hebrew so I don't want to upset people. But Vayidufu Hadan, the Shloshesrei, the various Pasukim, etc., etc. And what's interesting is Orthodoxy has never really dealt with Bible criticism very well by the time of Louis Jacobs, and I would even argue even to this day. And it's interesting that Rabbi Sachs, who kind of wrote on pretty much anything and everything and always did it lucidly and brilliantly, never, to my mind, in any meaningful, significant, systematic way, ever approached the problem of Bible criticism, either because through previous issues he decided it wasn't somewhere he wanted to tread, or because he couldn't find a useful way of dealing with it or talking about it. Amongst rabbis, there were different ways. Some people said, well, you can treat Nach historically, that's Nevi'im and Ketuvim, so it's okay to talk about Deutero-Isaiah and a Deutero-Isaiah, or it's okay to talk about a Maccabean psalm, it's okay to say that, By the Rivers of Babylon wasn't written by King David, but when it comes to the Torah itself, that has to be treated as a single whole. Or you can kind of allow yourself to do lower criticism, which talks about different letters, curricatives, things like that, but not higher criticism, which talks about authorship. Why is that important? So in 1957, Louis Jacobs wrote this book, We Have Reason to Believe. We Have Reason to Believe was the result of weekly classes that he'd held with his bright, secular, educated, Orthodox Jewish members of his shul, who were struggling with their Judaism in the modern world. And the whole book is really an attempt to synthesize two things: reason and Judaism. And most of the book, it's really good, it's still worth reading, I'd highly recommend it, I recommend all his books, deals with topics in a completely uncontroversial fashion. Proof of God's existence, pain, theodicy, miracles, afterlife, chosen people. And in fact, if you were to tear out 3 chapters in the middle, it would be an unimpeachably orthodox book. It would be a lot more boring, but there'd be absolutely no, we would have no reason to believe it would cause any trouble at all. He himself described it as a true Jewish apologetic, eschewing obscurantism, religious schizophrenia, intellectual dishonesty, based on the conviction that all truth, the seals of the Holy One, blessed be He, is one, and that a synthesis is possible between the permanent values and truth of tradition and the best thought of the day. But of course, there was these 3 chapters, and the 3 chapters talk about the origin of the Torah. He argues that lower criticism is desirable and acceptable, but he also admits that higher criticism is a problem, and, this is a quote, no work of Jewish apologetics, however limited in scope, can afford to fight shy of the problem. And then he comes up with a number of reasons how you can reconcile the two. And he's written a number of books, and I've read them all. And essentially, it all comes down to when you say Torah from heaven, it all comes down to what from means. If it means literally drop down in one go, he doesn't accept it. If you talk about from as being a process with some human intervention, but also divinely inspired, then Louis Jacobs argues that you can still believe in Torah min hashamayim, but not in an absolute literal, what he would call a fundamentalist way. What was interesting was the initial reception of the book. I mean, this was the ultimate dog that didn't bark. In fact, the only meaningful review that you can find is from Mizrahi, which was very positive, didn't even notice these 3 chapters, or if they did, they didn't understand them, which was, I think, what most people in this case. We know of at least 9 Orthodox rabbis who read it, none of whom kind of noted anything wrong with it. And there was no opposition. Now, that's not to say Jacobs wasn't aware of the damage it could do. Some of his friends warned him to postpone publication. It's already important that by now, in his shul, which, as I say, was the shul of the great and the good, we talked before about the cousinhood. His shul was really the kind of where the cousinhood drove to pray on Shabbat, okay? And he was seen by them as possibly a future chief rabbi, certainly a future leader of Anglo Jewry, and therefore some of them didn't want him to kind of blot his copybook before he kind of rose too high. Well, he said no. He said it's important that people know what his views are so that he can't later be accused of trying to hide them, trying to sort of pretend he believed in things he didn't read. We do know that one Diane read it, Diane Swift, Scouser, good for him. And Jacobs actually later believed it was Diane Grunfeld who was responsible, so there's a little bit of a confusion about who was the first Diane to read it. But whichever Diane it was, he immediately realised that this was, from the Orthodox point of view, apicausis, this is heresy, and this kind of couldn't be allowed to go without a response at some point. So before we come to the Jacobs affair itself, the very last piece of background is the current chief rabbi at the time, Rabbi Brody. And after Hertz, he was the ultimate safe pair of hands. He was a really impressive person as well in his own way. He's chaplain twice in 2 wars. He had been to Oxford. He served in Australia for a long time. But it's fair to say he had a very limited Talmudic background. I mean, Louis Jacobs probably learned more in a week than Brody learnt in his life. It's fair to say, I know it's not. More importantly, he agreed on taking office that he would have this reduced power that Whaley Cohen wanted. He was happy to have a more powerful Beit Din to kind of take a more aggressive role in order, as I say, so you had really 3 points of power: the lay leadership, the chief rabbi, and the Beit Din. And it's clear that Brody, I think scared is probably too strong a word, but he was apprehensive of the growing power of the Beit Din. And unlike Rabbi Hertz, he felt himself not to have the, not intellectual, he didn't have the Torah background to be able to stand up to them, certainly on halachic matters. So, the Jacobs affair was an affair in 2 parts. So the first part really happened in 1960. And at the time, there was Jews College, and it was a bit of a mess. It had been designed to be the place where reverends were taught to become reverends and people were taught to go into the ministry, but it was losing its focus. And one of the ironies about the whole affair was the Orthodox world, the Gateshead world, the world of the Beit. I mean, to say they looked down on Jews College would probably be putting it mildly. For them, it was an institute. They talked about it in very disparaging terms. But Jacobs was appointed to be the moral tutor to teach Talmud and homiletics. And it's slightly confusing, but almost certainly it was on the clear understanding, certainly his understanding, that he would become principal when the current principal, Epstein, who was a great scholar, some Talmud and other books, phrase, when Epstein retired. This was never formally done, there was no formal piece of paper, but Makata, who's in charge, and other people clearly also believed that this was a stepping stone. He would become moral tutor, in charge of training rabbis, and in due course he would then become the principal, and, this is even more murky, but many of the lay leadership believed that this itself was a stepping stone, the principal of Jews College, to the chief rabbinate itself. Interestingly, at this time he was sounded out about being a Dayan. He was actually offered a position to be a Dayan. There's lots of interesting what-ifs in this whole saga, but one of the more interesting things is what would happen if he'd become a Dayan and had to sit with Diana Bramsky. In fact, Diana Bramsky basically and his colleagues made it clear that they weren't prepared to allow him to join the Beit Din. He retired, sorry, Diana Bramsky's colleagues, In any event, it soon became apparent that this plan wasn't going to work. Partly because Epstein himself didn't want to retire. He felt a little bit put out that he'd been kind of pushed into what he believed was premature retirement. But more than that, many of his colleagues, and I think this was a point that wasn't really made so clear at the time, most of the faculty of Jews College were very wary of Louis Jacobs already. They already believed that his published and his known views were at the very edge at best of what is acceptable. In the last couple of years of him being the rabbi in New West End, which of course he had to retire from in order to take the position at Jews College, he'd had a couple of run-ins with Rabbi Brody over attending non-kosher functions, over allowing people to speak, and a whole load of things where he was already being marked out as someone who you had to keep an eye on. Anyway, the understanding was he would take over, and Brody just never gave an answer, essentially. He kept avoiding it, kept trying to put it off. Interestingly, while he was still putting it off, the Beit Din let it out the bag. The Beit Din basically said, because he's written stuff that makes him an apikoros, but that wasn't the official position of Rabbi Brody. And then I think he made his first two big mistakes, was he then publicly stated the reason why he wasn't prepared to appoint Louis Jacobs was because of his scholarship. His scholarship wasn't up to it. Now, that was ridiculous on a number of levels. First of all, his scholarship was impeachable. I mean, his book on Teiku, or book on Talmudic methodology, I mean, they're absolutely fantastic, and they are incredible scholarship. He had a photographic and a retentive memory. He could pretty much remember anything he'd ever written, where it was on the page, etc., etc. So there were lots of reasons to say he wasn't suitable for the post, and in fact I'm very sympathetic to that view, certainly in retrospect. But to say scholarship is a reason first it was nonsensical, it was an ad hominem attack, but it was even worse coming from Rabbi Brody, who, as we've said, if another scholar had said it, then you can say, okay, it's a bit of an argument between two great scholars. But for Rabbi Brody to attack Louis Jacobs' scholarship made Rabbi Brody out to be a little bit of a fool in that sort of particular regard. So there was a clear impasse, but Brody made it absolutely clear he wasn't going to appoint Louis Jacobs. So in 1961, Louis Jacobs resigned, and many members of Jews College resigned with him. And when we talk about winners and losers, which we might do at the end if there's time, I think Jews College was probably the biggest loser, really. This possibly, maybe it was already too late, was really the last chance, I think, for Jews College to become a world-renowned centre of Jewish scholarship if Louis Jacobs had taken over. And I actually think it probably would have been the perfect job for him. People talk about he was the best chief rabbi, he never was. I mean, he was voted in some weird Jewish Chronicle poll shortly before his death the greatest Anglo-Jew, which just means that Masorti people know how to vote online. And he actually, I think, would have been a pretty disastrous chief rabbi. I mean, he wasn't a natural administrator, he wasn't really particularly collegiate. He would have been a brilliant administrator at Jews College, and certainly a brilliant tutor. So then you had an interlude, because he's now resigned, he's given up his shul, Chaim Pearl's taken over, and he needs something to do. He's got to earn a living, and he was very lucky that he had a number of wealthy backers, and B, had a number of high-profile admirers all over the world. And he was offered a number of posts abroad in South Africa, many in America, and he turned them down. And he turned them down because the lay leadership were keen to keep him in the community. There'd been a bit of a debate over the last few years about a number of young Anglo-Jewish stars who had left, and they were desperate to keep Louis Jacobs on British soil. And he turned down JTS, he turned down a number of institutions, and instead they set up something called the Society for the Study of Jewish Theology. It was an interesting group, and their publications actually are still worth reading today. But it was a sense, this wasn't going to be a job for life. This was something to keep him over, to allow him to have a parnassa, but there was a sense that something had to give, that he needed a more meaningful, permanent means of employment, and he therefore was very, very close to go abroad. And probably the biggest publicist on his behalf, who was trying to keep him in the United Kingdom, was the Jewish Chronicle. And when I give this talk, normally someone boos. Well, I remember growing up, whenever we mention the JC, someone would go, "Jacob's affair." So they got a lot of stick over it, and they probably did fan the flames. I mean, from a journalistic point of view, it was a wonderful story. I mean, you'll be mad not to. I mean, this was it was, of course, it was a fantastic story. I mean, it was also in the Times. There's a famous interview with Bernard Levin. It's worth watching. It's available on YouTube. At the Times, there was at the time, a little bit in Jacobs too, there was a thing with the Bishop of Woolwich, so who also had a scandal roughly at the same time as Jacobs Part 2. So it was taken up by all the non-Jewish press as well. But in the Jewish world, it was really the Jewish Chronicle which turned what was a story which people had known about word of mouth to something which became like the weekly talking point. The editor was Frankel, and he was a great friend, he was a great supporter of Louis Jacobs. He was even-handed in terms of letters he published, but obviously the editorials were all on Louis Jacobs' side. And Rabbi Brody came to dread Fridays. He came to literally dread, what was said, and it certainly had a toll on his life. Frankel himself was upset by what he believed to be the move to the right. He wanted to stop it. He wanted to turn back the clock or keep the clock where it was. But he really wanted a much more progressive, tolerant, liberal orthodoxy, and he believed that Louis Jacobs was the rising star of Anglo Jewry and was the man who was able to mould Anglo Jewry, and more than that, save Anglo Jewry. He believed with firm conviction that Louis Jacobs would save Anglo Jewry and save the United Synagogue. So, we come to Jacob's Affair Part 2, and that erupted in 1964 because Jacob's successor at the New West End, Chaim Pearl, got a new job, and interestingly it describes the kind of shul and the kind that it already was, that he went to be Rav of a conservative shul, Riverdale, in America. So the shul then turned to Louis Jacobs and they asked him to be rabbi again. This was unanimously appointed by the board. And the shul's assumption at the time, and I've seen as much evidence as I can and nothing to the contrary, they honestly believed that this would just kind of go through on the fly. It was seen as the perfect solution. He would go back to where he was before, where he'd previously been appointed. He would take his old job. He would be surrounded by the lay leadership who liked him, who admired him. And in the meantime, he was kind of slightly shunted off because it was, as I said, it was a shul that was atypical and he could do less damage there. So what happened, and this is where it gets a little bit murky, if there is and I apologise if there's a relative here, if there is a sinner, let's not use the word sinner, if there's someone who I think is to blame for Louis Jacobs Part 2, it's probably Silverman, who was the secretary of the United Synagogue, because he decided to raise the question, if you get reappointed to your shul, do you need to get authorization from Rabbi Brody? And he approached Rabbi Brody vocally, I mean, approached him in person, and Rabbi Brody basically said, don't ask me, don't ask me. And the Beit Din said, don't ask him. As far as the Beit Din, as far as Rabbi Brody were concerned, let it happen. So what did he do? He publicly wrote, he said, according to the protocols, laws, I can't remember what the word is, according to the United Synagogue Constitution, you, Rabbi Brody, as far as I know, you have to publicly authorize Rabbi Louis Jacobs to be reappointed to the shul. And that, of course, put Rabbi Brody in a terrible spot because he previously, number one, he previously appointed him to the role, and number two, he'd subsequently appointed him to a role to train rabbis. And he was now in a position to say, this rabbi is not only unfit to do the job I previously said he could do, but he's unfit to do the job which I previously said he could train himself to do. But that was essentially the Jacobs affair part 2, was would he be allowed to go back to his shul? The Beit Din, who in Jacobs part 1 had put a lot of pressure on Rabbi Brody to be strong and to stand up when he himself was wavering and was kind of, in two minds about giving way, now they, more clandestinely than publicly, urged Rabbi Brody, as I say, to allow it to happen because they didn't see any great danger. But often when you've been accused of being weak in the past, you then decide you have to kind of show yourself to be strong. So there's an argument, I'm not sure how committed I am to it, but there's an argument to say that he was weak when he should have been strong and he was strong when he should have been weak. And ultimately he said that Brody was unfit for the pulpit and that he wasn't allowed to preach. So what happened? The shul asked Jacobs to preach, he got up, he preached, and then there was a meeting, and I won't get into all the shenanigans, because even by shul politics standards, this is really boring. Another change that happened was that Sir Isaac Wolfson had now taken over as at the United Synagogue, and ironically, he was in favour of Jacobs going back, but once Rabbi Brody made it clear he wasn't going to do it, he backed him absolutely and completely. Now, I'm not 100% sure if he really was in favour. That's kind of what members of the family have said to me in oral and other sources, but at the time, certainly, there's no doubt he very, very publicly and aggressively backed Chief Rabbi Brody. And in fact, interestingly, he took it to a vote. Normally, there's a secret ballot in the United Synagogue for decisions like this. And most people believed that the United Synagogue Board would vote against Chief Rabbi Brody and against Wolfson and allow Jacobs to go back. You have to remember, most people didn't understand what the theological argument was about. It was over most people's heads. So by now, it became much more British fair play, the underdog, and now he was seen as a bit of bullying. It's okay to say someone isn't fit for a promotion, but it's another thing to say they're not fit to go back to the job that they previously had. But Wolfson said, no, it's going to be a public vote, and you have to know that many members, the figures are slightly unsure, a very, very large number of the people who voted either worked directly for him, did business with him, or were keen to do business with him and didn't want to lose the ability to do business with him. And as a result of that, he got his way and the board voted. And the lay leadership were up in arms, and this is kind of obviously slightly ironic because they'd spent most of the previous 200 years totally ignoring any principle of democracy and running the community exactly the way they wanted to. But now that they'd lost power and the new, well, they weren't middle, the kind of new, less aristocratic people were taking over, suddenly they were very upset about what they believed to be lack of democratic norms. So again, the story itself isn't very exciting. I'm happy to sort of talk about it in questions. But in a nutshell, the vast majority of the board of the shul went along with Louis Jacobs, and they set up the New London Synagogue. And this later became the parent of the Masorti movement. And it was at this time, it was Louis Jacobs' affair part 2, which really became the public cause célèbre. And therefore, when you read the press and when you read it, it's much more a story about not allowing the man to do the job he wants to do, rather than a story about theology, about Torah Min HaShamayim, which kind of makes sense because no one really understands. I've read 4 books by Louis Jacobs about Torah Min HaShamayim, and I'm not sure I still know exactly what he means by it. So it's kind of, these are quite arcane philosophical, theological distinctions to understand. It was very discomforting for the United Synagogue because it was painted correctly as obscurantist, as heresy hunting. But that really was the end of the affair. There was a few other little things I'm after. So first they moved in, they had a couple of buildings where they prayed in, and eventually a building came up for sale, which was actually a previous United Synagogue shul. They'd moved, and so they moved into that in St John's Wood. And if there's another hero, and I've forgotten his name, and it's Yaakov? No, the property developer. Louis. Yep, he was very, very impressive because what did he do? He basically agreed to sell it. So he essentially, the building was first sold, and he believed he could make almost 100% profit because property prices go up, particularly this is swinging London, this was the 60s, and he sold it at exactly the same amount of money that he first got. Essentially, he refused to make any profit on a shore. So they moved in, and it became the first. Interestingly, and this is where there's a slight Scottish connection, first of all, the Masorti movement grew very, very slowly. I mean, there's even to this day. Sorry? I thought you were asking me something. So.
It didn't start off Masorti.
No, it didn't. It became, over time, it became Masorti. And I was just about to say, so Louis himself was always very, very ambivalent about what he was. They were an independent Orthodox synagogue. Rabbi Louis Jacobs always, for many, many years, called himself independent Orthodox. He was very Minhag Anglia. It was a very decorate service. It was a very Anglo-Jewish service. It was really the service of kind of, New West End from the 20s and the 30s, mixed choir. It was a very, it was really, it was slightly kind of harking back to the past. It was almost anachronistic slightly. It's probably a bit of a harsh word. But it wasn't, for a long time they talked about will they become an independent movement, will they merge with the Conservatives, and I won't go into the history of that because that's really a different question. Eventually they did, but what was the case, one more thing before I talk about that, was there were faint echoes really for the rest of Louis Jacobs' life about the affair. There was an event in Bournemouth with an aliyah. There were other times where he had to fight to allow conversions to be allowed, weddings. But he's also, he's a hero amongst who, do you know? Chabad. He's a hero amongst Chabad, And the reason why is because there was a famous court case between the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Gori, the other son-in-law, about the library. And the question is, was it a personal library or was it an institutional library? And Louis Jacobs, we don't know if it was definitive, but most people believe that his evidence he gave, where he talked about the Rebbe representing an institution, and therefore the Rebbe didn't have personal belongings, but what belonged to the Rebbe belonged to the institution, swayed the court case, as a result of which the library became the property of the Chabad movement. And so whereas today, if you go to Gateshead, it's like Louis Jacobs never existed, his name has been taken down, his name has been expunged. In Chabad, I have to, he's a little bit of a hero. So, conclusions, and I'm always reluctant to do this because I actually change my mind every time I think about it. What do I think? So in one sense, I think Louis Jacobs was clearly a victim. On the other hand, I'm not sure that actually he almost didn't get what he wanted. As I say, he chafed when he was a rabbi at having to have a chief rabbi telling him what to do all the time, being told, kind of having a rabbi above him. Well, now he was leader of his own congregation. One of the reasons actually why they did merge, become Masorti and move other congregations was he actually missed having colleagues. He didn't miss having a rabbi above him, but he did miss having colleagues he could bounce ideas off. And obviously he was always tremendously busy. He wrote many books. He also was the Ask the Rabbi in the Jewish Chronicle for many years. Every week he answered questions, and ironically, in the Orthodox world, they were all convinced that this could only be an Orthodox rabbi. In fact, sometimes the people would complain that why they got such a, they've got a Meshuggah rabbi, they've got a Meshuggah Haredi, and actually it was Louis Jacobs who wrote it. I think it's now clear that already by late 1950s, early 1960s, there was a discernible move to the right in Anglo Jewry. There's no doubt that a century earlier, he probably would have been an acceptable candidate for chief rabbi, and there's probably no doubt that his views, obviously documented parties came later, but he would have, his views wouldn't have been a problem, his theology wouldn't have been a problem. I think already by the late 1950s, it was probably too late for a man with Jacob's views to have a prominent role in the United Synagogue. And he himself, he talked about the Jacobs affair 4 or 5 times. There was a couple of other revisions of We Have Reason to Believe. He wrote another book, he wrote his autobiography, and only in the last time I'm aware that he addressed the Jacobs affair in one of his latest books, or last books, Beyond Reasonable Doubt. There he quite explicitly says, by the standards of today, I'm not orthodox. By the standards of today, my views in the late 1950s were not orthodox. And I think there's an argument the standards of today were already germinating, at the very least, in the 1950s. So I think he was unlucky in a number of ways. He was unlucky in his timing. He was probably a generation too late. He was unlucky that the chief rabbi was weak when he should be strong, and strong when he should be weak, and probably mishandled the situation. There's definitely a sense he was I wouldn't say the unwitting victim. For many years he was pictured as a victim of people who were fighting on his behalf, manipulating him. I don't think that's the case. He knew what was going on. He knew what people thought, and I won't say he didn't allow himself to be manipulated. He allowed them to speak on his behalf. They might have thought they were using him, but I don't think they were misleading him. I think he knew what was going on. And I also think he was fighting a battle that was already lost. And I think really what it comes down to is probably the Shoah. I think the Churban of Europe, the destruction of European Jewry, I think for many people signalled the end of this kind of progressive Judaism, this Hirschian Judaism, which Hertz himself tried to carry on, particularly in Germany. This idea of synthesis in the Orthodox world just had the idea that European culture, German culture had anything to offer, the idea that the academic world had anything to offer other than solace, I think as a result of the Holocaust was really gone for good in large sections of the Orthodox world that was growing demographically, politically. It was a pyrrhic victory for the United Synagogue. Anyone who read the Calms report, kind of 20 years later, roughly, 25 years later, bore the Calms report, pretty stark, and bore out many of the dire predictions that Jacob's supporters said would follow on for the United Synagogue if it shunned tolerance and synthesis and progressive and etc., etc. The United Synagogue, and I belonged to United Synagogue when I lived in England, and I think United Synagogue is a great institution. It's a remarkable institution in the sense that it has this huge kind of broad demographic, something we don't have here in Israel by any means. And I think it was a real shame that the United Synagogue wasn't able to find a role. I guess in conclusion what I would say was that there wasn't a place for Rabbi Louis Jacobs as head of Jews College by that time. Certainly there wasn't a place for Rabbi Louis Jacobs as chief rabbi. He wouldn't have been a very good one, frankly. But there was a place for Rabbi Louis Jacobs within the United Synagogue, and I think it was a shame that that wasn't able to happen. And that's really it. That's the two Jacobs affairs, and I'm happy to take questions in Hebrew or English.
Please raise a hand. In Mark I was saying to Jonny before the meeting, we had a mini version of it in Glasgow because Reverend Cosgrove, who was the minister at Garnet Hill, the fashionable West End shul in town, decided to side with Rabbi Jacobs, and that he wanted the shul to associate with what became the his new London synagogue. And Cosgrove lost the vote in the shul, not by very much, but he lost the vote mostly because the Chazan at the time, Reverend Siegel, said that he would have to leave the shul if this went ahead, and that swayed quite a bit of the opinion. But nothing happened to Cosgrove afterwards. He carried on as the rabbi there for another decade or so. Rabbi Gottlieb, who was the Ab Bet Din, didn't take anything out on him. As Jonny says, he was just really unlucky where he was at the time and the issues he had to face.
Sorry, just following on from that, so one of the most weird things, as I said at the start, about the Jacobs affair was it was ultimately a theological argument in a community which, I wouldn't say shies away from theology, but it's not the forefront of most people's interest. And in fact, even at the time of the Jacobs affair, it's one of the most interesting things when you look at the letters, where the vast majority of people had absolutely no idea what it was about. People write in, how dare Louis Jacobs say there was no creation? And then people just did not understand the arguments. They had no idea. No one knew but the vast majority of people who took, kind of quite angry sides on it were very personalised.
The present Shabbat morning service in Rabbi Jacob's shul has mixed seating and full participation of women in davening from the Amud and Leilin. From what you've said, it sounds as though Rabbi Jacobs would be appalled at these developments. Would you agree with that comment?
Question. So the question is I don't know. I know New North London much better because I have a lot of family connections there, and certainly New North London has women rabbis, mixed seating, fully egalitarian services. And the question was, would Rabbi Louis Jacobs have been appalled? Apologies if I get it wrong. Would he have been appalled at contemporary Masorti services? And again, there's probably people who know this better than me because it's slightly outside my comfort zone. My understanding is many people in the Masorti movement chafed at what they believed to be his reactionary position. This reactionary position was based on a couple of things. Partly, he did believe in halachic progress. In fact, one of his best books is where he talks about flexibility in halakha, and another one which talks about theology and a responsa, both of which talk about halakha being creative. So he did support a creative halakha. He did support finding halakhically suitable solutions where possible for pressing contemporary problems. Having said that, by his very nature, he was quite a conservative person. He was very British, which meant he believed in very small piecemeal change. But more than that, he was, as I say, he was psychologically wedded to a form of service which really was the kind of Anglo-Jewish pomp and ceremony of the kind of late Victorian Edwardian period, which isn't the happy-clappy service. So how much of his reactionary behaviour was the result of theological opposition? Some of it. I think it was more personality. But he also did say on many occasions that organisations needed to grow, and he was very conscious that he didn't want to be a break. He wanted the organisation to find its own way. I don't think he would have been appalled, but I think he would always have preferred, in fact he said it himself, he always preferred to daven with the Orthodox. David Weiss Levy said the same thing. I think deep down he wanted to preach to the Masorti, he wanted to talk to the Masorti, he wanted to daven with the Frummers.
Dr. Wolfson, thank you so much for that. It took me back as my exploration of Judaism coincided with the Jacobs affair. And you're right that 64 was the big issue rather than 61. I was chairman of the Jewish Society in Manchester at that time. Louis Jacobs came to speak. We had to take it out of Hill House and put it in the Students' Union. There were 300 people packed there, quite a lot of them non-Jews. The great thing about the Jacobs affair was Jewish students kept coming up to us saying, what's it all about? So we had a job of teaching them what it was all about, and that was part of our own education. If I could just embellish something, one or two things you've said, and add. Mayor Pierce of Oliver Sholem, who was a member here and contributed, has written a number of research books on the Chief Rabbinate and so on. And he speaks about the Jacobs affair by explaining that in the archives, he was a great archivist. He looked in the archives. A terrible job to do, but he did it. And he found letters from Diane Swift in the late 40s to other rabbis. This is after Jacobs had left Golders Green and had gone into Manchester Central Shul, which was hardly the hotbed of radicalism. I mean, he tells there that he was giving a Gemara Shir after Shacharit, and I was giving a Gemara Shir in another shul in Yiddish after Mincha. So going from that milieu into New West London was a big shock, I think, to him. But Diane Swift wrote to one of his colleagues saying, effectively, we have to watch this man. This is not based on anything he'd written in 1957. This is already the stories coming out of what he'd taken from University College. I think the main issue, which I think you alluded to, but first didn't, is that Dewey Jacobs said there was Torah min Hashemayim, but not necessarily Torah min Sinai, and that was the difference. And he stressed and we have reason to believe that effectively, if you can believe Torah min Sinai, good, and if that keeps you an Orthodox practicing Jew, fine. His book was meant to be, can you still be an Orthodox practicing Jew if these things cause you problems? And he was trying to find a way, and his way was to say that God spoke through these individuals, whether it was the people who redacted the Torah or the rabbis subsequently interpreted it. God spoke through them, and that was his very conservative view.
I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second, so in case people didn't hear, I think that was a really important point, and it gets lost, and I think that's the gentleman made a really interesting point, that Rabbi Louis Jacobs wasn't, contrary to what many in the Orthodox world trying to spread heresy. He, as you said, wasn't trying to convince people who believed in a literal fundamentalist Judaism that they were wrong. He was worried about the children of his members at New West End. He was worried about, he saw them. One of the interesting things that happened when we come back to the Jewish Chronicle, and it comes into this, was that Frankel, about 6 months or a year before, had given a series of interviews to young British Jewish writers. I presume no Wexler, I presume it's, Pinto and no others. And the thing that shocked him was almost every single one of these young Jewish radical people had no interest in Judaism at all. And he was shocked and worried that we were losing an entire generation. And as you said, Rabbi Louis Jacobs wasn't trying to tell the Orthodox they were wrong. He was trying to find a way to stay in orthodoxy for those who had been exposed to Bible criticism and didn't know how to deal with it. So,
No, my last point is a humorous one, which is, you said it was a London synagogue. As you said later, it was the St John's Wood synagogue that, through Louis Mintz, New London took over. And the great thing about the St John's Wood synagogue is where the chief rabbi davened when he was at home for Shabbat. And stories told that the night before it was due to be handed over, somebody or group broke into the New London synagogue, St John's Wood synagogue, and removed the chief rabbi's chair.
They didn't just remove it, they smashed it.
So that there was no chance Louis Jacobs would sit in the chief rabbi's chair.
Yes, they were happy for him to preach, but they weren't happy for him to put his tochus where the chief rabbi put his.
Anybody else got a question? I seem to have silenced everybody. A very comprehensive talk. I'm going to ask now Simon Wiseman, wherever he is. There, you're too near. Goes a vote of thanks.
Wow. An amazing overview. Whistle-stop tour. The clarity of the competing interests. Thank you very much. It was excellent.
Just Rubin, for me to give our speaker copies of the two publications which our branch has produced over the last 15 years. So maybe you'll come back and if you find a broigus in either of these, we'll definitely have you back to talk about it. Our next meeting, actually there are one or two copies for sale if you haven't got Out of Zion, our latest one. Our next meeting is exactly 4 weeks from tonight, when Stefan Reif, formerly the head of the Geniza Taylor Schechter unit at Cambridge, will be speaking not about the Geniza or Minhag Anglia, which he's also quite an expert on, but on a trove, an archival trove, which has turned up. Stefan's father was part of the Polish soldiers who came to Britain during the Second World War, married, settled in Edinburgh. But this collection of material are letters that were sent from family in Poland in Yiddish, which has now been translated, but doesn't talk about the trivia of everyday life, but the real problems that Jews were facing in Poland at the time. And I'm sure it will be a very, very interesting talk. That's 4 weeks exactly from tonight. So anyway, thank you all very much for attending, and we hope to see you again at meetings in the future. One of the ones we haven't got a date for yet is that the National Library are inviting us to come, where they will give us a to the library, where they will give us a presentation on their holdings related to Jewish history. So many good things to follow.